When we talk about muscle tissue in the body, there's three different types of muscle tissue that we're referring to: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. The first one that we're going to consider is skeletal muscle, and there are over 700 skeletal muscles within the body, and the large majority of them are going to be on the surface. There are some exceptions to that, like the diaphragm is the skeletal muscle that divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. However, muscle tissue is widely distributed through the body. And as I mentioned, there are three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle that we're going to consider. When we look at this slide, we're seeing skeletal muscle, and it's considered an organ because it's composed of the four different types of tissue. There's going to be connective tissue nearby, nervous tissue, as well as epithelium nearby. When we look at this slide, some of the important features that we see are striations marked by these bands. Skeletal muscle is usually attached to bones, and the muscles and the muscle size are going to vary in shape and size. They are huge muscles. In fact, this is the outline of one particular skeletal muscle here. We can see that they are multinucleated. There's one nucleus here, another nucleus here, another nucleus here. And of course, the most prominent thing would be these striations noticeable on this image. For the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle, there are bundles of muscle fibers which are organized into what's called a fascicle. These individual muscle fibers contain what are called myofibrils, which are complex cylindrical organelles. And those myofibrils are composed of myofilaments, which are microscopic size proteins called myosin and actin. We can see the organization of a skeletal muscle here, beginning at the tendon. The tendon is what's going to attach the skeletal muscle to the bone. So this is showing the entire skeletal muscle. The membrane that is surrounding an entire skeletal muscle is what's called an epimysium. Within that epimysium are organized fascicles. Each fascicle is surrounded by a connective tissue membrane called a perimysium. Within that fascicle is individual muscle fibers, which are surrounded by a connective tissue membrane called the endomysium. So these are individual muscle fibers. As we look a little closer now at the muscle fiber, we can actually see the endomysium, that connective tissue membrane surrounding it. And then when we pull out the organelles called myofibrils, they can be further enlarged, and we eventually see the functional unit of a muscle called the sarcolemma. So it's important that you know that that is the functional unit of the muscle. It's actually where the contraction itself happens. And then on the sarcomere, and the sarcomere is actually the functional unit of the muscle, not the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma, so excuse me for that, the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane that surrounds the sarcomere. And then at the top of your slide, you see the fascicle, which we've already talked about. So the organizational levels of the skeletal muscle are shown here. We begin with the muscle, and within the muscle are multiple fascicles. And again, that connective tissue covering is the epimysium. The fascicle has a connective tissue covering called the perimysium, and it's a bundle of muscle fibers separated by other bundles of fibers. And then the muscle fiber, which is also called the muscle cell, the connective tissue layer around it is the endomysium. They would be multinucleated cylindrical fibers or cells. This would be the skeletal muscle itself that we saw on that microscope slide. Going even deeper, we can see the myofibril, and that functional unit of the muscle is what's called a sarcomere. The sarcomere is one single unit that is shown on this slide. This is a long cylindrical contractile element within the muscle fiber. And then even further inside that are the microfilaments or the myofilaments. They're proteins of two different types. If they're thick filaments, they're called myosin. If they're thin filaments, they're called actin. And then actin is actually regulated by two other proteins called tropomyosin and troponin. So muscles have multiple layers of connective tissue around them. It's important that you know them in order. So surrounding the entire muscle is the epimysium. Surrounding the fascicles would be a perimysium. And then surrounding each muscle fiber, which is each muscle cell, would be called an endomysium. Underneath endomysium is a plasma membrane called the sarcolemma. Muscles are attached by a tendon. Tendons go from muscle to bone. Remember, they are dense, regular connective tissue. They're a rope-like structure formed by merging connective tissue at the end of the muscles. And most muscles are going to extend over a joint and attach bones on either side of the joint. So the muscle contraction usually causes one bone to move while the other bone remains fixed. Muscle attachments, there are two different ones. The less mobile attachment is called the origin, and the more movable attachment is called the insertion. Muscles that move the axial skeleton have a superior attachment and an inferior attachment. Muscles that move the appendicular skeleton have a proximal attachment as well as a distal attachment. So the actions of the muscle occur when the superior attachment is pulled towards the inferior attachment, or the distal attachment is pulled towards the proximal attachment. So this diagram is showing you an example of the attachments for the biceps brachii muscle. You can see the tendon is going to attach to a bone. So we have our proximal attachment, which is the origin. And the origin is always the stationary bone or the less movable bone. And the distal attachment, the insertion, is going to be the more movable attachment.